October 14, 1962. The air inside the National Photographic Interpretation Center on K Street in Washington was thick with cigarette smoke and the mechanical clicking of light tables. The building, an unmarked facility operated by the CIA, was staffed by photo analysts who spent their days examining grainy reconnaissance images of Soviet military installations. Most of what they saw was tank formations in East Germany, airfields in the Ukraine, naval construction at Murmansk. The work was tedious, essential, and usually uneventful. Arthur Lundahl, the director of the center, was hunched over a light table in the main analysis room. He was a quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses, a professional who had spent his entire career teaching others how to see what was hidden in shadows and pixels. On the table before him were freshly developed strips of film from Mission 3101, a U-2 reconnaissance flight that had crossed western Cuba the previous morning. The pilot, Major Richard Heiser of the Strategic Air Command, had flown his fragile aircraft at 70,000 feet, far above the range of Cuban air defenses, and photographed a tract of farmland near the town of San Cristobal. Lundahl picked up a magnifying loupe and leaned closer. What he saw made his breath catch. In the wooded area south of the farm, partially concealed beneath camouflage netting, were shapes that did not belong. Long, cylindrical objects. Transporters. Support vehicles arranged in a precise geometric pattern. Lundahl had seen this pattern before. He had spent years studying Soviet missile installations in the Western Soviet Union. This was not a farm. This was an SS-4 Sandal medium-range ballistic missile site under construction. He called over his deputy, a photo interpreter named Sidney Graybeal. They examined the images in silence. The evidence was unambiguous. The Soviets were installing nuclear-capable missiles 90 miles from Florida, missiles that could strike Washington in 13 minutes. 6,000 miles away, in a heavily guarded compound outside Moscow, Soviet military intelligence had been operating under a very different set of assumptions. For months, they had monitored American reconnaissance capabilities with professional detachment. The U-2 aircraft was a known threat, but it was also a manageable one. The high-altitude spy plane was vulnerable. It was slow. It had been shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960 by a surface-to-air missile. Its days, Soviet analysts believed, were numbered. American satellite reconnaissance was still in its infancy, producing images of limited resolution. The Soviets had calculated that their missile deployment to Cuba, codenamed Operation Anadar, could be completed in secrecy. They believed they had time. This confidence, this carefully reasoned and utterly catastrophic miscalculation, was the product of a system that had convinced itself it understood the balance of risks. Soviet planners knew the Americans flew reconnaissance missions. They knew the U-2 existed. They had even assumed, correctly, that the Americans would eventually discover the missiles. But they believed discovery would come too late. By the time Washington understood what was happening, the missiles would be operational, the warheads mated, and the strategic balance of the Cold War would be irreversibly altered. What they did not know was that American photo interpreters, trained to read Soviet military installations, would identify the missile sites within hours. And they did not know that this premature discovery would ignite the most dangerous moment in human history. The laughter was not loud. It was the quiet, assured confidence of professionals who believed they had covered every angle. That confidence was about to shatter. Because the Americans could see. And what they saw, captured on film at 70,000 feet by a single fragile aircraft, would bring the world to the edge of annihilation. The Lockheed U-2 was not just an aircraft. It was a system. It was a marriage of airframe, optics, film chemistry, and trained human analysis that created what intelligence professionals called overhead reconnaissance. This was not new in concept. Aerial reconnaissance had existed since the First World War, when pilots in open cockpit biplanes sketched enemy trenches with pencils. But the U-2 system represented a revolution in resolution, altitude, and analytical precision. The aircraft itself was an engineering paradox. Designed by Clarence Kelly Johnson at Lockheed's Skunk Works facility in Burbank, California, the U-2 first flew in August 1955. It was built like a glider with a jet engine attached. Its wings spanned 80 feet, giving it the lift necessary to cruise at altitudes above 70,000 feet, where the air is so thin that the sky turns a deep violet and the curvature of the Earth becomes visible. At that altitude, it was beyond the reach of most Soviet interceptors and surface-to-air missiles in 1962. But altitude alone was not the secret. The secret was the camera. Mounted in the U-2's belly was a device that intelligence historians would later describe as one of the most important inventions of the Cold War. The camera, designed by Edwin Land, the founder of Polaroid, and built by the Hikon Manufacturing Company, was capable of resolving objects as small as 30 inches from an altitude of 70,000 feet. It used a rotating prism system that scanned the ground below in overlapping strips, exposing film at intervals synchronized with the aircraft's speed. The film itself was a technological marvel. It was a high-resolution emulsion developed by Eastman Kodak, capable of capturing details that would remain sharp even when magnified dozens of times under a photo interpreter's loupe. When Major Heiser flew Mission 3101 on October 14th, his camera exposed 2,800 linear feet of film. Each frame captured a swath of Cuban countryside roughly 125 miles wide. The camera did not discriminate. It recorded everything: roads, buildings, vehicles, trees, shadows. And hidden in the wooded farmland near San Cristobal, it recorded the precise arrangement of the Soviet SS-4 Sandal missile site. The film was flown to the Naval Air Station at Jacksonville, Florida, then rushed by courier to the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington. There, it was developed, printed, and laid out on light tables for analysis. This process, from wheels up in California to images on a light table in Washington, took approximately 16 hours. The photo interpreters who examined the film were not casual observers. They were specialists who had spent years studying Soviet military equipment. They knew the precise dimensions of an SS-4 missile transporter. They knew the standard layout of Soviet launch facilities. They knew the support vehicles, the fuel trucks, the command bunkers. When they looked at Heiser's photographs, they were not guessing. They were identifying equipment they had been trained to recognize. This was the U-2 photo intelligence system. It was not a single tool. It was an integrated capability that spanned aircraft design, optical engineering, film chemistry, logistics, and human expertise. The Soviets understood parts of this system. They knew the U-2 flew high. They knew it carried cameras. But they fundamentally underestimated the resolution of those cameras and the skill of the interpreters who analyzed the imagery. They believed they could camouflage their missile sites well enough to delay discovery. They were wrong. The system worked because it was designed to see what others wanted to hide. And in October 1962, what it saw was the physical evidence of Soviet strategic deception, captured in such detail that no argument, no denial, no diplomatic maneuvering could erase it. The photographs were proof. And proof, in the nuclear age, was the most dangerous thing of all. The problem was simple and terrifying. What were the Soviets building? In the early 1950s, the United States faced a strategic intelligence gap. The Soviet Union was a closed society, its military installations hidden behind vast distances and obsessive secrecy. American planners knew the Soviets had atomic weapons and were developing bombers and missiles, but they did not know how many, where, or how advanced. This created the bomber gap and later the missile gap, fears that drove defense spending based on threats that might not exist. Traditional human intelligence could not solve this. The Soviet Union was too large and too ruthless in its internal security. What was needed was overhead reconnaissance. In November 1954, a group led by James Killian of MIT concluded that the United States needed a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft capable of overflying the Soviet Union before Soviet air defenses could react. They wanted an aircraft flying above 70,000 feet, beyond the reach of Soviet MiG fighters, with their 50,000-foot ceiling. Richard Bissell, a CIA official, approached Lockheed's Kelly Johnson with the challenge. Johnson's answer was the U-2. The first prototype flew in August 1955, built in secret at what would become Area 51. The U-2's first operational missions over the Soviet Union began in July 1956. The flights were diplomatic gambles, clear violations of international law, but President Eisenhower authorized them, and despite the risks, the early missions were revelations. The bomber gap was exposed as a myth. The Soviets had far fewer long-range bombers than feared. But this success had a cost. On May 1, 1960, Francis Gary Powers was shot down near Sverdlovsk by an SA-2 surface-to-air missile. Powers survived and was captured. The incident was a diplomatic disaster. Eisenhower was forced to admit the overflights, and a planned summit with Khrushchev collapsed. The U-2 overflights of the Soviet Union were suspended, but the system survived, flying missions over China, Cuba, and other denied areas. When the Soviets began secretly deploying missiles to Cuba in summer 1962, the U-2 was ready. The problem that birthed the system had simply moved to a new theater, and the stakes were no longer just intelligence, they were survival. The U-2 program faced skepticism from its inception. The Air Force resented the CIA's control. Legitimate concerns existed about the aircraft's fragility and political risks. The shoot-down of Francis Gary Powers in May 1960 validated every skeptic's fear. The supposedly invulnerable U-2 had been destroyed. Powers' capture created a propaganda windfall for Moscow and humiliated Eisenhower. Within intelligence circles, some argued for terminating the U-2 program. Satellite reconnaissance seemed safer. The Corona satellite program, achieving its first successful film recovery in August 1960, offered imagery without political risks. But satellites had limits. In 1962, satellite resolution was far inferior to the U-2. Corona could identify large installations, but lacked detail to distinguish equipment types or assess construction status. For that precision, you needed the U-2. Satellites also followed fixed orbital paths. The U-2 could be directed to specific locations based on intelligence tips. Doubts extended to photo interpretation itself. Reading meaning from shadows required experience and intuition. Two interpreters might reach different conclusions from the same image. Arthur Lundahl at the National Photographic Interpretation Center fought this perception, recruiting veterans and developing rigorous training, but the work remained part art, part science. Early U-2 missions over Cuba, beginning in October 1960, produced mixed results. They confirmed Soviet military equipment and MiG fighters, but nothing initially considered a strategic threat. American analysts believed the deployments were defensive, designed to protect Castro from invasion. This assessment was wrong, but reasonable. The Soviets had never deployed nuclear weapons outside their own territory. The idea they would secretly install missiles in Cuba seemed reckless even by Khrushchev's standards. By late summer 1962, troubling signs emerged. Cuban refugees reported large military convoys moving at night, describing long cylindrical objects under tarps. The reports were vague and easily dismissed. But in August, CIA Director John McCone became convinced the Soviets were planning something significant. He urged Kennedy to authorize more U-2 flights. Kennedy was reluctant. The political situation was delicate. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, another shootdown would provoke an international incident. The bureaucratic compromise was caution. U-2 flights were authorized but limited, avoiding areas with SA-2 missiles and focusing on the periphery. This caution created blind spots. The skeptics seemed to have won. The U-2 was too dangerous, too vulnerable. Satellite reconnaissance would take over. Then, on October 14th, Major Richard Heiser flew Mission 3101. The gamble produced the most important intelligence photographs of the Cold War. The skepticism evaporated. The U-2 system's strength lay in its interpretive framework. Trained analysts transformed grainy images into actionable intelligence using years of studying Soviet military practices. When Lundahl's team examined Mission 3101 photographs, they applied a codebook they had developed over years. The San Cristobal images were unambiguous. Missile transporters, support vehicles, and geometric layout matched known Soviet SS-4 Sandal patterns. The SS-4 had approximately 1,000 nautical mile range. From western Cuba, it could strike Washington, Dallas, or the Panama Canal. It carried a 1-megaton nuclear warhead. A single strike on Washington would kill hundreds of thousands instantly. Analysts found a second site near Sagua La Grande, with identical patterns. Soviet technicians were constructing multiple SS-4 facilities simultaneously. By October 15th afternoon, Lundahl had compiled irrefutable findings. The scope and clarity of proof was shocking. Photographic evidence's strength was its immunity to denial. Most intelligence is probabilistic, subject to doubt. Photographic intelligence was physical evidence. The missiles were measurable, their specifications calculable. No ambiguity existed. This was the hidden strength. It delivered certainty. When Kennedy needed irrefutable proof, that certainty was invaluable. On October 16th morning, Lundahl briefed CIA Deputy Director Carter, who ordered a presidential briefing. That evening, National Security Advisor Bundy was informed. Recognizing the gravity, Bundy waited until morning to inform Kennedy, not wanting to wake him with news requiring careful deliberation. At 8:45 on October 16th, Bundy entered Kennedy's bedroom. "Mr. President, there is now hard photographic evidence that the Russians have offensive missiles in Cuba." Kennedy's reaction was controlled but grim. The photographs removed all doubt. By 9 o'clock, Kennedy convened an emergency cabinet room meeting with Rusk, McNamara, Robert Kennedy, Bundy, and McCone. Lundahl presented the evidence, walking through the analysis. The construction was approximately 50% complete. Missiles weren't operational yet, but would be soon. The room was silent. The photographs transformed abstract threat into concrete crisis. The U-2 system had provided the one thing needed most: the truth. The discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba created an immediate problem that transcended intelligence gathering. The United States government now possessed definitive proof of a Soviet deception, but it did not yet have a clear strategy for. Over the next 6 days, President Kennedy and a small group of advisors, which came to be known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM, grappled with options that ranged from diplomacy to military invasion. The role of the U-2 system during this period was not passive. Intelligence gathering is not a one-time event. It is a continuous process of updating, refining, and expanding understanding. Even as Kennedy and his advisors debated their response, U-2 flights over Cuba continued. Each mission added new data. Each mission revealed the pace of Soviet construction and the scope of the deployment. On October 17th, a second set of U-2 photographs revealed something even more alarming. At two additional sites, near Guanaje and Remedios, photo interpreters identified components of SS-5 Skian intermediate-range ballistic missiles. The SS-5 had a range of over 2,000 nautical miles. From Cuba, an SS-5 could strike any target in the continental United States except the Pacific Northwest. The deployment was not just a regional threat. It was a direct challenge to American strategic dominance. The intelligence also revealed the timeline. The SS-4 sites at San Cristobal and Sagua La Grande appeared to be nearing operational status. The SS-5 sites were less advanced but progressing rapidly. CIA analysts estimated that the first SS-4 missiles could be ready to fire within 1 to 2 weeks. This timeline was not abstract. It was a countdown. Kennedy's advisors were divided on how to respond. Some, including Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay, advocated for immediate military strikes to destroy the missile sites before they became operational. LeMay argued that a surgical air campaign could eliminate the threat with minimal risk. Others, including Secretary of Defense McNamara and Undersecretary of State George Ball, warned that airstrikes would likely kill Soviet personnel, escalating the crisis into a direct confrontation between the superpowers. The risk of nuclear war, they argued, was too great. Kennedy himself leaned toward a middle course, a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent further Soviet shipments and to buy time for diplomatic negotiations. The blockade, which the administration carefully termed a quarantine to avoid the legal implications of an act of war, would signal American resolve without immediately triggering a military confrontation. But it required proof. If the United States was going to impose a blockade on Cuba and confront the Soviet Union publicly, it needed to justify its actions to allies, to the United Nations, and to the American public. This was where the U-2 photographs became not just intelligence, but evidence. The Kennedy administration decided to declassify a selection of the imagery and present it publicly. On the evening of October 22, Kennedy addressed the nation in a televised speech. He revealed the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba and announced the quarantine. The speech was blunt. "This secret, swift, and extraordinary buildup of communist missiles," Kennedy said, "is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo, which cannot be accepted by this country." The following day, October 23, United States Ambassador to the United Nations Adlai Stevenson presented the photographic evidence to the UN Security Council. In a dramatic confrontation, Stevenson challenged Soviet Ambassador Valerian Zorin to deny the presence of missiles in Cuba. Zorin refused to answer directly, calling the accusations provocations. Stevenson responded by displaying the U-2 photographs on large easels. "These," he said, "are the facts. Let me show them to you." The images were grainy, black and white, and to an untrained eye, not immediately comprehensible. But Stevenson walked the council through what the interpreters had seen. He pointed out the missile transporters, the launch pads, the support equipment. He explained the dimensions and capabilities of the SS-4 missiles. The presentation was designed not just to inform, but to embarrass the Soviet Union. The photographs made denial impossible. This public use of intelligence imagery was unprecedented. Intelligence agencies guard their sources and methods obsessively, fearing that revealing how information was obtained will compromise future operations. The decision to declassify the U-2 photographs was a calculated risk. It exposed the capabilities of the U-2 system to Soviet scrutiny. It confirmed that the United States could photograph installations in Cuba with extraordinary resolution. But it also served a critical strategic purpose. It rallied international support for the American position and put the Soviet Union on the defensive. The doctrine of using photographic intelligence as a diplomatic weapon, turning secret evidence into public proof, was a new development in Cold War strategy. It would be repeated in subsequent crises, most notably in Colin Powell's presentation to the United Nations before the Iraq War in 2003. But in October 1962, it was a revelation. The U-2 system was not just a tool for gathering secrets, it was a tool for revealing them. The intelligence continued to flow. 2 missions were flown daily, weather permitting. By October 25, analysts had identified a total of 6 missile sites under construction in Cuba, 3 for SS-4 missiles and 3 for SS-5 missiles. The photographs also revealed that Soviet Il-28 light bombers, capable of carrying nuclear weapons, were being assembled at Cuban airfields. The buildup was even larger than initially assessed. The doctrine of how to use this intelligence evolved in real time. Each new photograph informed the next decision. Each new discovery shaped the next diplomatic move. The U-2 system had proven its value as a tool for discovery. Now it was proving its value as a tool for managing a crisis. The photographs provided Kennedy with the situational awareness he needed to calibrate his response, to know when the Soviets were accelerating their deployment, and when, eventually, they began to dismantle it. The Soviet leadership in Moscow did not laugh when they learned that their missiles had been discovered. They did something worse. They denied it. And then they calculated. On October 23, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sent a message to President Kennedy. He accused the United States of piracy and aggression. He claimed that the Soviet shipments to Cuba were purely defensive. He did not acknowledge the missiles. This was a standard Soviet tactic: deny, deflect, and buy time. But Khrushchev was not operating from a position of ignorance. Soviet intelligence had closely monitored American reconnaissance activities over Cuba. They knew the U-2 flights were occurring. They had even attempted to shoot down the aircraft, deploying SA-2 surface-to-air missile batteries to the island specifically for that purpose. But they had underestimated two critical factors. They underestimated how quickly the Americans would detect the missiles, and they underestimated how definitively the photographic evidence would expose their deception. The Soviet plan, Operation Anadyr, had been conceived in the spring of 1967. Khrushchev, stung by the American deployment of Jupiter intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Turkey which could strike Soviet cities, decided to respond in kind. Deploying missiles to Cuba would, he believed, redress the strategic imbalance and protect Castro's government from American aggression. The operation was conducted in secrecy. Soviet personnel traveled to Cuba on passenger ships, disguised as agricultural advisors or engineers. The missiles themselves were shipped in the holds of cargo vessels, hidden beneath deck cargoes of machinery and grain. Soviet planners assumed the deployment could be completed before the Americans understood its scope. They believed the camouflage netting, the forested terrain, and the limited frequency of U-2 flights would delay discovery until the missiles were operational and mated with their nuclear warheads. Once operational, they reasoned, the missiles would become a fait accompli. The Americans would protest but ultimately accept the new strategic reality, just as the Soviets had accepted American missiles in Turkey. This assumption was based on a fundamental misreading of American intelligence capabilities and American political resolve. The Soviets knew the U-2 could take high-resolution photographs. They had captured Francis Gary Powers' aircraft and examined its camera, but they underestimated the sophistication of American photo interpretation. They did not realize that American analysts had spent years studying the precise layout of Soviet missile installations, that every detail of a launch site's construction sequence was cataloged and understood. The turning point came not in a single moment but in a cascade of realizations. When Kennedy addressed the nation on October 22 and revealed the missile's existence, the Soviet leadership understood that their deception had failed. The American reaction, a naval blockade and the threat of military action, was far more aggressive than they had anticipated. And the public display of photographic evidence at the UN removed any possibility of plausible deniability. The world now knew what the Soviets had done. On October 24, Soviet ships carrying additional military cargo approached the quarantine line that American naval vessels had established around Cuba. The world held its breath. If Soviet ships crossed the line and American warships attempted to stop them, the confrontation could escalate into a shooting war. In Moscow, Soviet military leaders argued for defiance. The ships should proceed. The Americans were bluffing. But Khrushchev, receiving reports of American military mobilization, began to doubt his own strategy. The United States had placed its nuclear forces on DEFCON 2, the highest state of alert short of imminent war. American bombers were in the air, armed with nuclear weapons, ready to strike Soviet targets. The risk of miscalculation was becoming unbearable. On October 24, Khrushchev ordered the Soviet ships to stop short of the quarantine line. They turned back. This was the moment the Soviet confidence cracked. The missiles in Cuba, which were supposed to strengthen Soviet power, had instead created a crisis that threatened to destroy everything. And the root cause, the thing that had transformed a secret operation into a public emergency, was a single U-2 flight on October 14. The photographs from that flight had changed the balance of power, not by altering the physical capabilities of either side, but by altering what each side knew the other side knew. The psychological impact was profound. The Soviets had been caught in a lie. Their deception had been exposed with such clarity that no amount of propaganda could obscure it. The photographs were proof. And proof, in a world where trust was already scarce, was devastating. The mathematics were brutal. By October 25, at least 20 SS-4 and 16 SS-5 missiles were being deployed. Each carried nuclear warheads. If fired, casualties would number tens of millions. But American nuclear forces also numbered in the thousands. A full exchange could kill over 200 million globally. These numbers were briefed to Kennedy. The industrial math of nuclear war, blast effects, fallout timelines were understood in grim detail. Every option carried risks. The challenge was avoiding catastrophe. 2 flights continued throughout the crisis, increasingly dangerous. On October 27, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr. was shot down by a Soviet SA-2 missile. Anderson's death raised stakes. Some advisors demanded retaliation. Kennedy resisted. Understanding strikes would kill Soviet personnel and trigger responses. The Soviets had invested enormous resources in Operation Anadyr. Khrushchev needed a way to retreat without appearing to capitulate. On October 26, he sent Kennedy an emotional letter proposing removal of missiles if the U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba. The next day, a second letter demanded removal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Kennedy responded publicly to the first letter, while privately assuring the Soviets that the Jupiters would be removed. This dual-track approach allowed Khrushchev to claim victory while giving Kennedy cover. On October 28, Khrushchev announced the missiles would be dismantled. U-2 flights verified Soviet compliance. By late November, the missiles were gone. The industrial math had not changed, but the immediate threat was eliminated. The crisis became a case study in decision-making under pressure, taught in universities and war colleges. For American intelligence, it was vindication. The U-2 had delivered decisive intelligence at the decisive moment, but the crisis created a dangerous myth that intelligence could solve crises. This was false. The photographs revealed the problem, but diplomacy, restraint, and compromise provided the solution. This myth would contribute to later failures where precise data about enemy capabilities was mistaken for understanding enemy intentions. For the Soviet Union, the crisis was humiliation. The forced withdrawal damaged Soviet prestige. Khrushchev was removed from power in October 1964. The Soviets drew lessons, accelerating their own satellite programs and developing miscalculation, comprehensive deception incorporating dummy installations and false signals. They also massively expanded their nuclear arsenal, seeking genuine parity. Kennedy pursued détente afterward. In June 1963, he called for re-examination of Cold War attitudes. The Limited Test Ban Treaty was signed in August, prohibiting nuclear tests in atmosphere, space, and underwater. The photographs themselves became iconic symbols, reproduced in textbooks but this mythology obscured an uncomfortable truth. The Soviets had deployed nuclear missiles nearly to operational status before detection. It had been a close call. The crisis altered the Cold War's character. Both superpowers confronted the reality that unchecked competition could lead to mutual annihilation. This did not end the Cold War but made it more constrained by implicit rules. The hotline was established in August 1963, providing direct communication. During the crisis, communications had been slow, relying on diplomatic cables taking hours to transmit. The hotline reduced miscalculation risks. Verification became central. Satellite reconnaissance matured into reliable monitoring. The US and Soviet Union eventually agreed that satellite reconnaissance, termed National Technical Means of Verification, was legitimate for arms control. What had been espionage became accepted international relations. The crisis demonstrated military power could be applied in calibrated non-kinetic ways, influencing development of flexible response strategy. For Europe, it reinforced NATO's importance but raised questions about whether European nations had sufficient influence over decisions determining their survival. Intelligence's role in the crisis became a model. Using photographic evidence to shape public opinion became standard practice, used in the Gulf War and before the Iraq War. The Powell presentation in 2003, unlike Stevenson's, was later discredited when intelligence proved wrong, highlighting the danger that photographic evidence is only as reliable as the analysis behind it. The crisis fundamentally changed the psychological landscape. Before Cuba, nuclear war possibility was abstract. After, it was real. Both sides had looked into the abyss and seen how quickly events could spiral. This created shared understanding that managing nuclear risk required constant vigilance and willingness to step back from the brink. Robert McNamara later described the crisis as the most dangerous moment in human history, emphasizing luck's role in avoiding catastrophe. He recounted moments when miscommunication could have triggered war, like when a U-2 strayed into Soviet airspace on October 27. McNamara also reflected on empathy's importance, understanding Khrushchev faced similar pressures and that recognizing the opponent was constrained, not irrational, allowed compromise. Theodore Sorensen wrote about Kennedy's determination to avoid military action if possible, haunted by World War I's lessons where mobilizations led to unwanted war. Kennedy repeatedly asked what would happen next if action were taken. The uncertain, escalatory answers pushed him toward blockade and diplomacy. Khrushchev, in memoirs published after his death, defended deploying missiles as response to American aggression, portraying the resolution as victory. But he revealed frustration at the speed of American Soviet military leaders later acknowledged the deployment was a strategic blunder based on flawed assumptions. At a 1992 Havana conference, Soviet officers revealed tactical nuclear weapons had also been deployed to Cuba, under Soviet commander control. American planners hadn't known. An invasion could have triggered their use and nuclear escalation. Castro admitted his position during the crisis had been extreme, willing to sacrifice Cuba to strike against imperialism, but acknowledged Khrushchev's diplomatic resolution was correct. Arthur Lundahl expressed pride in his analyst's work, but emphasized intelligence limits. Photographs showed what Soviets were building but couldn't reveal intentions or predict responses. Intelligence was a tool, not a crystal ball. These reflections paint the crisis as profound uncertainty. Participants operated in a fog, making decisions on incomplete information under immense pressure. That it ended without war was not inevitable, but the result of restraint, communication, and compromise, qualities never guaranteed in crisis. On October 14, 1966, Major Richard Heiser flew Mission 3101. To him, it was another reconnaissance mission. But the images were different. They captured Soviet missile sites with such clarity they could not be denied, transforming abstract nuclear threat into immediate crisis. The U-2 system's strength was its precision. It could see what others wanted hidden. The Soviets had dismissed early detection likelihood. Soviet intelligence knew U-2 capabilities, had examined Powers' camera, and tracked flights. But they underestimated the photo interpreters who could recognize missile sites from geometry, underestimated American resolve to act on intelligence, and underestimated U.S. willingness to risk confrontation. The transformation reshaped the Cold War. It led to better communication, arms control agreements, and shared understanding that nuclear war was unwinnable. But it entrenched intelligence's role in statecraft. Using photographic evidence to justify policy became standard. When intelligence was accurate, as in Cuba, it served peace. When flawed, as in Iraq, it led to disaster. The U-2 flew for decades after, used in Vietnam, the Middle East, Balkans, and Afghanistan. But the real legacy is recognition that precise, timely information can be as powerful as weapons. The photographs exposed truth, giving leaders information to step back from the brink. Soviet dismissal was real. 1. They believed American intelligence would be too slow to detect deployment in time. A single reconnaissance flight shattered this confidence, revealing secrecy's limits in the overhead reconnaissance age. The world came closer to ending than most realized. The U-2 system didn't create that fragility but revealed it, forcing superpowers to confront whether weapons built to deter war become instruments of destruction. The answer, in grainy photographs on a Washington light table, was that survival depends on wisdom to control weapons. The U-2 gave Kennedy information for informed decisions and evidence to justify actions, but wisdom had to come from human judgment, from willingness to listen, compromise, and accept. There are no winners in nuclear war. From dismissal to crisis, secrecy to exposure, confidence to terror. The U-2 and Cuban Missile Crisis story shows how information changes history. It shows how a single photograph reveals hidden truth, and it shows how the world, faced with truth, chose survival. The choice was not inevitable. It is a choice every generation must make again.